The reputation of two-dimensional games took a hell of a beating during the 5th generation of consoles. Often referred to as the 32-bit generation, it was an extremely weird time where many consumers and gaming companies saw anything with 2D visuals as old or behind the times. Polygon graphics had redefined a number of genres thanks to the dramatic shift in how gamers viewed the action. The added depth of racing, flight sims, and even platformers made things feel entirely new, and many developers felt that if you wanted your game to stand out, polygons were the only way to make it happen. It wasn't that everyone felt this way, but it was prevalent enough that there are far fewer pure two-dimensional titles that generation than perhaps any other. Even when a winner like Castlevania Symphony of the Night was released in 1997, it did not sell well immediately. Konami itself was sure it was gonna come and go with little fanfare, and hardly bothered to advertise the thing. It took a media blitz of outstanding reviews and player word of mouth before the game finally started to move units. While it would go on to perform well at retail for Konami, it was still far from the polygon hits of the day. I don't mind telling you that I was shocked when it was announced for the Sega Saturn. It was clear by this time that Sega had intended to replace the Saturn very soon, so for them to announce it so late really surprised me. Konami even promised additional content to an already stellar experience. And that's the episode you are about to see. Many of my subscribers often ask me, do these extras make the Saturn edition worth playing? We are going to go over all that additional content included in the Saturn version of Dracula X Nocturne in the Moonlight, and answer that very question. Let's get started. The first area we will look at can be found in the new options menu outside of the game itself. If you go into the sound test, you will find new music to jam to, remixed versions of past songs that sound great. Here are a few samples for you. When you boot up the game, you are greeted with a character select screen. Here you can choose Alucard, the main protagonist and the default choice in the PlayStation original. New additions to Alucard include a third hand in your inventory so you can equip consumables like food. This allows you to pop some immediate health replenishment without going back into the menu. Also new to the Saturn edition are the Godspeed boots, which give Alucard a speed bump by allowing him to run. Double tap the direction you want to go to activate them. You will find these at the start of the second castle. Richter Belmont is also selectable, which turns the game into an experience that's much closer to a traditional Castlevania adventure. Many of the RPG elements present when playing as Alucard are missing, and it's more a straight action title. To compensate for this, Richter has a number of helpful powers that give him the ability to pretty much go anywhere he wants outside of a few story-related triggers. He also has some nasty item crashes that can decimate everything on the screen. These items use hearts as a sort of ammo counter, which you collect by breaking items and killing enemies all over the castle. Richter was present in the original PlayStation edition, but was hidden behind a code once you defeated the main campaign. The Saturn Richter also has an alternate costume that can be selected by pressing up when you choose your character. The third selectable player is Maria, who is very similar to Richter in that most of the RPG elements are not available to her. She has a set of magical powers that are similar to Richter's in that they are designed to make up for her lack of leveling and upgradable equipment. Used correctly, they can be quite potent in battle. Be aware that Maria is not an easy character to play. Her base attack is very weak, so you'll need to practice using her secondary abilities to beat the game. Until you learn and are able to perform these, she is the most difficult character to use for beginners. Even though there is a playable Maria in the PSP port of this game, it is not the same, leaving the Saturn interpretation unique. It is also interesting that during the Alucard campaign, Maria appears as a boss to test your skills. This battle is a mere conversation in the PlayStation original. Let's have a look. The Saturn version has a number of new items in the game. There's the Astral Dagger that has a special homing attack you pull off with a fireball motion. The Alucard Spear has two specials, a flurry with a fireball motion, then a quick dash by using back then forward quickly. The Double Blade Axe is two-handed and has a high attack rating. The Woodland Shield has a summons where vines attack enemies if you are using the shield rod. The Delicious Meal is a food consumable that gives you 75 hit points. The Smelly Rice is a food consumable that inflicts poison damage to you. The Signed Pencil Board is a strange item that doesn't seem to do much at all. The Glaring Cloth replaces the Crystal Cloak that originally appeared on the PlayStation. It's bright white and grants you immunity to darkness attacks. The Rainbow Mantle cycles through colors constantly. The Song Lyrics card is another strange addition that has the lone function of allowing your fairy familiar to sing to you if you sit in a chair. The Saturn version also has two exclusive areas added to the castle. The first is known as the Underground Garden and is at the entrance of the castle. Fall down into this botanical nightmare and you are greeted to a number of new enemies and a new boss encounter. These enemies are fairly simple and offer no real challenge. There are demons that fly around slowly, a bone warrior that has a dog on a leash, fish that have wings and can jump out the water. There's a tree that throws fruit at you and has some cool animation. Deeper in, you'll face some crazed gardeners that wield hedge clippers. There's also a giant Venus flytrap that attempts to devour you. At the end of the area, you will face the only new boss of the two exclusive areas, an armored warrior called the Skeleton Leader, who has a number of melee and projectile-based attacks. Be aware that if you do not have the bat form yet, you cannot get to this boss because his entrance is up so high. Fortunately, this area does have its own teleport room, so you can easily return. The second area, the Cursed Prison, is at the very center of the castle and is just a series of hallways and platforms loaded with ghosts that resist physical damage and a pile of repeated enemies from other sections of the castle. There is no boss in this area, and if you come at the left entrance connected to the Marble Gallery, you will be blocked and can't go any further. You must enter into the right side coming from the underground caverns, so you can hit the switch to lower the wall that blocks your path. Remember, though there are only two new areas, you do get the reverse variants of them in the second castle. The Underground Garden becomes the Hell Garden, and the Cursed Prison becomes the Soul Prison. There are no boss fights in these upside-down versions, but you will see the odd new enemy, such as a shielded skeleton guardian and a fire demon named Ifrit. Let's check out a few highlights. In truth, these new areas are curiosities at best. The music used for these areas are a fun throwback and sound great, but there are no prolific or memorable bosses. And if I'm being honest, some of these new rooms are actually quite frustrating to navigate with anything less than the top tier weapons. Enemies fill the screen and often have some gimmick that makes them harder to defeat, such as invisibility or lots of invincible frames. I'd say you can certainly tell they were tacked on extras without much planning and genuinely add little to the overall experience. If I had to pick one standout feature of the additional content, it's the inclusion of Maria as a playable hero. Her arsenal of magic attacks are performed like fighting game moves and adds a unique feel to the game all her own. Despite that, she still isn't a can't miss feature. Alucard is still the bread and butter of this game, and like Richter, Maria is a fun diversion good for a playthrough, and that's about it. That leaves us with the burning question: is the Saturn's exclusive content worth its weight in gold? Absolutely not. If you have only played the PlayStation original, there is little here of value for you that is truly worth going out of your way to play in the Saturn version. If you are a super fan and looking for the standout feature, again, it's Maria. And since Saturn emulation is easy and reliable these days, she is worth a play to see how the adventure differs. I want to stress that emulation part, because a real copy of this title sells for upwards of close to $200, which is ridiculous when considering the Japanese PlayStation equivalent sells for 1/3 of the price. The Saturn version is still a great game overall. There are just other ways to play it that look and perform better, not to mention, they're much cheaper. It would be remiss of me to include a list of extras that exist in the Saturn version and not mention the price you pay to access them. I'm not talking dollars and cents here, but rather the gut punch that was the quality of the porting job. First are the resolution changes that sees the screen stretched, which affects everything from the sprites to the backgrounds. If you are sensitive to this kind of change, you will notice it on many things, particularly anything that has diagonal art assets. Another big issue are the special effects. Since the Saturn didn't have the same type of hardware support for transparencies, many of them are represented by mesh variants that do not look anywhere as impressive. This is noticeable even on a CRT and can be incredibly off-putting when it fills the entire screen in areas like the underground cavern. To add insult to injury, the transparent mist that would show up in the outer wall area after it rained is stripped from the Saturn edition entirely. Another big negative is the increased load times in between areas, and the additional loading you must endure just to get to the map screen. But by far the worst of the issues is the performance hit the Saturn edition suffers. In many areas you will notice slowdown rear its ugly head far too often. Slowdown exists in the PlayStation original, but in the Saturn it can happen in areas where there's no enemies at all, and when it strikes at its worst, it can bring the game to a crawl. Some boss encounters are affected by this to a degree that actually makes them more difficult. None of these things ruin the overall experience of the Saturn version, it just makes the PlayStation release the better choice overall. There, it's cheaper if you want to own the physical disc, and it looks and runs better. Even Koji Igarashi, who worked on the original, denounced the Saturn version as not living up to the standard expected of the series. The Saturn edition of Nocturne and the Moonlight was programmed by Konami Computer Entertainment Nagoya, who typically handled smaller projects and ported existing games to different hardware. They are often labeled a B team, and the quality of this port is attributed to their apparent lack of skill. I have come to reject this as utter nonsense. Konami Nagoya also ported Vandal Hearts to the Sega Saturn, and that port turned out excellent. The key difference between the two projects is when they were in development and released. Vandal Hearts was released in 1997, which means it likely began development in 1996 while the Saturn was still moving units and alive and well in Japan. Nocturne in the Moonlight was released in mid-1998, after it was clear Saturn was being replaced and Dreamcast was only a few months away. I personally feel that this game was originally intended to have a much longer development cycle by Konami, but the announcement of the coming Dreamcast came so fast that it gave Konami cold feet, and they demanded the porting team wrap the project up and ship it immediately. There is no better evidence of this than a 2-page feature in the official Japanese Sega Saturn magazine, where they visited Konami Nagoya Studios to talk about the game nearly a year before its release. They were so upbeat and positive about its move to the Saturn at that point. Eventually, Konami would release the game in its poor state at a bargain bin price for its Japanese premiere. Retailing for just 3,800 yen, it was nearly 50% of the cost of normal Saturn releases. Konami knew they had a game with issues and they sold it at a price that reflected it. In the many years since its release, pundits and fanboys have used this game as further proof the Saturn was weaker than its rival, but I believe this had little to do with the hardware or the team that was porting it. This was Konami doing what Konami does. It was all about the Benjamins, customers, and reputation be damned. I'm Sega Lord X. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.